presentation is brought to you by the ScHO Foundation. Over 50 years of research towards curing cancer the natural way.
Thank you, Alex. So I'm Dr. Jason Pape. I'm a chiropractor, holistic functional medicine practitioner right here in Comac at the Vitality Center. We have a great booth, stop by with a lot of great practitioners. So I was asked to kind of step in last minute and talk a little bit. So we're going to talk a little bit more really about optimizing your genetics to improve your metabolism and weight loss. So we can call it by the skinny gene or whatever you want to say. So the first thing we really have to understand is that we've all heard the term survival of the fittest, right? Really, it's not true. It's really survival of the most adaptable. And if we didn't have the ability to adapt, we wouldn't all be here right now, right? All our ancestors would have died off, we wouldn't be here. So we're very lucky. A lot of the lottery has happened well for you guys, that we all kind of went through thousands of years of generations that brought you all here. And the adaptation is great because it allowed us to exist, but our bodies have only so long you can adapt in certain situations before it starts to make changes, sometimes for the negative. All right, so there's a good and bad thing that we can adapt. And genetically speaking, we're still basically the same thing we were thousands of generations ago. We are hunter-gatherers. That's our genetics. That's what we're made up to be. And hunter-gatherers had a certain diet and a certain life that they led. They were eating fish, fowl, beef, pork, fruits and vegetables, some nuts and seeds. That was the major diet of most hunter-gatherers. And there were times when we had food, and there were times when we didn't. And when times we didn't, we would go into these, we called it starving back then, but we call it fasting nowadays. And our bodies had to be able to get through those lean times. And we really were genetically built to have a specific fuel source that allowed us to get to those times. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But it's understanding that also our genetics are kind of somewhat hardwired as to what we are. But there's a field called epigenetics. I don't know if many of you have heard that before, but epigenetics is something that can actually change your gene and gene expression within your lifetime based on the choices you make. And those choices that you make and the changes that have happened to you can actually be passed on to the next generation and the following generation and the following generation. So the choices we make and how our body adapts to those choices and where the fail points may be can set us up for good or bad. So one of the things we deal with a lot in this country is obesity and insulin resistance, better known as type 2 diabetes. Now, when I first went to school, we didn't call it type 1 and type 2. So, I mean, they did call it that, but they really call it juvenile or adult onset. Nowadays, they don't use those words anymore because too many kids are developing type 2 diabetes. It was this kind of thing that we would get later in life, but it's become a younger and younger issue, and we're having a generation of overweight and unhealthy children. So what's happened? Well, things have shifted in what we're exposed to, right? We're not hunter-gatherers in the way we live anymore, right? We have food in almost any corner at any time of day you want it. We don't really go through periods of starving. Our bodies have been given a different fuel source, and we adapt to that to a point. Our genetics are still our genetics. We're still what we were originally, hunter-gatherers. And sometimes what things we choose to do or how we eat or how we live, and then other generations before us may have set us up to have weak points. We start to gain weight. We start to hold weight. And then all the things that go with it. So when we talk about type 2 diabetes, it's called insulin resistance. So in general, with any kind of diabetic situation, it's where blood sugar goes up and it can't get into the cells and it's unhealthy. Right? I mean, there's a lot of things that can go with that. No one wants diabetes, right? We need insulin. It's a hormone to help get sugar into cells, glucose into cells for us to use for fuel. Now, that's not something we're supposed to be exposed to all the time. It's actually a storage hormone. So think back a little bit again to a hunter-gatherer. Hunter-gatherers had periods of food and not food. So when we had food, it was plentiful. We used glucose as a main fuel source. And our body, when it used up the little storage space it had for glucose, would put the rest away for safekeeping because it knew genetically in our genes that there were times where we weren't going to have food. Making sense? So we had to be able to take that excess and store it for the lean times. Our body can only store about 2,500 calories worth of glucose. Stores it in our liver, stores it in our muscle, and a little bit in our blood. That's it. And if those of you who don't know, glucose is a very fast-burning fuel. So it's not going to be a thing that you're going to be able to use through lean times for very long because you only have about 2,500 calories of stored fuel, and after that, it's gone. And the body will look for glucose in other places. One of those places is your muscle, because the body can break down carbohydrates and most protein into glucose. And what happens is, I don't know about you, but if you went through a period of fasting where you weren't going to have food for a few months out in the wild, and your body burned through its glucose stores in a day or two, and had nothing else to do but burn glucose, it would break down your muscle tissue. And over time, you lose more than 50% of your muscle, you die. Sarcopenia is dangerous, especially as we get older, because as we get older, we start burning a little bit of that muscle. And losing at least 50% of your mass is, you can't live. And now imagine, even doesn't matter about that. Imagine that you lost all that muscle mass, and now it was time to go chase down a deer or a rabbit or something, because it's time to eat. How are you going to chase it if you have no muscle mass? How's your brain going to function in those places when it doesn't have any glucose? Because you burned through all your stores and half your muscle mass. It's just not going to work. So the body adapted. The body had to have another option for fuel, and those fuels were something called ketones. Many of you have heard of them, many of you have not, but ketones were when your body breaks down fat and makes ketones. Ketones do not need insulin to get into cells, and they are a much longer lasting sustainable fuel source. When you break down fat, you can actually make 3,400 to 3,700 calories worth of fuel out of a pound of fat. Now remember, we can only store about 2,500 calories of glucose, right? So look how much energy is in 1 pound of fat. So the body was made to shift back and forth between two different fuel sources, right? Ketones and glucose. And actually, as a hunter-gatherer, we were meant to be using ketones 70% of the time, 7-0, all right? 30% of the time, glucose. Now think about it. How often does that happen nowadays? Almost never. Very rarely are any of us using ketones for fuel. Okay, unless you're like a marathon runner or you're giving a fast or maybe a little bit overnight, we're very rarely ever having ketones or using them as a fuel source. Glucose has become king, right? We're born in ketosis, the state of having high elevated levels of blood ketones. Our brains are supposed to have that as a main fuel source early on as children. In fact, there's a higher affinity in the brain for ketones than there is for glucose in an infant. So as long as we continue to breastfeed after we're born, we're staying in ketosis. But as soon as we stop breastfeeding, what happens? Well, we start eating carbs and we don't starve. So we all think of that as this great thing of the new centuries that we don't have to starve, which is nice. We don't want to have the opportunity to starve to death, if you will, but we never lose our fuel sources. And what are we told for the last 60 years? Fat is bad for us, right? Fat's going to clog your arteries, going to do all these things, and it's really not true. When I speak a little bit more tomorrow, we'll get a little bit more into that. But in general, fat is actually good, healthy fats are important in our diet. So our bodies really are meant to be burning a different fuel source most of the time. And since we burn glucose all the time, problems arise. So think about it. Insulin is what gets glucose into cells. Insulin is a storage hormone. And excess glucose gets stored as fat, right? We talked about earlier that's what your body does with that excess stores, because it doesn't know when it's going to have the food source dry up. So even though we live like this, where we can come sit and have a nice lecture and eat our food when and where we want, that's not what we're genetically made to be. So we're living outside of what our programming is telling us. And yes, we can adapt. Some people may develop diabetes at their 20s. Some may develop it in their 40s. Some may never develop it. But the difference right there is about epigenetic expression. It's like, what's your fail point? We are all genetically predisposed to something. All right? Nature loads the gun, but nurture pulls the trigger. Meaning that there may be some things in your genetic code that you may be predisposed to developing, but you don't have to develop it. You're not a slave to your genetics. So a lot of people sometimes, if they're overweight and having trouble losing weight, they just think, oh, well, my parents were overweight, or I've always been this way. I can never be thin, or I can never lose the weight. Well, there's other reasons going on there. Yes, you may have some genetic predispositions, and you may have turned some things on, some genes on or off that we didn't want epigenetically, but those things can be changed. Deepak Chopra will actually tell you that 95% of our genes are mutable. They are changeable. And by changing lifestyle and diet and nutrition with supplementation and other things like that, we can actually shift a lot of that. Now, changing what I eat is not going to change my eye color. Unfortunately, it's not going to make this come back. But it's definitely can change how our bodies function. Right? Is this all kind of making sense? Everyone with me? I know I'm not supposed to take questions. I want to make sure everyone's with me. All right. So think about insulin as a hormone that our body doesn't normally supposed to see on a regular basis. Remember, only about 30% of the time we were burning glucose. So it wasn't something we were exposed to all the time. But I just said a minute ago that we're burning glucose almost all the time now. So we're constantly being bombarded over and over and over again with a hormone that our cells are not supposed to see as often as they do. So what happens is they get tired of listening to someone ringing the doorbell. and they become resistant to the insulin. All right? Does that happen to everybody? Like I said before, everyone's genetically predisposed to something, and maybe you had that gene turned on by someone previously before you were conceived by a parent. But our goal is, how can we switch that? Well, one thing is to remove the over-toxification of your body by insulin, right? If you're constantly exposing your body to insulin, that means you're constantly exposing your body to glucose. Changing your fuel source can be very impactful to how your body functions. So I talk a lot about what's called the ketogenic diet or ketogenic lifestyle. Some of you may have heard it. It's kind of a catchphrase or a buzz, big thing nowadays. Some people want to call it a fad. I call it a lifestyle. Any diet can be a fad if you do it for a short period of time with just the only goal of just losing a little weight. We talk more about shifting how you live so that way you feel and function better. I don't know about you. I don't know what I'm genetically predisposed to, but I don't want to find out by expressing it, right? I'm going to be as clean as I can in what I put into my body, what I eat, how I treat myself, so that way I can minimize the chance of something being expressed. Right? We all have a genetic code to live a certain amount of time and all these kind of things. And again, with telomeres the way they are, those are things that kind of snip the end of your DNA. We don't want to shorten any of that. I don't know about y'all, but I say y'all a lot, even though I'm from New York, not from the South, where we can genetically live up to about 120 years. I want to live that long, and I want to live a healthy, quality life, because we don't want to, live till 90 if 20 of those years are spent, not having a good quality of life, whether it's mentally or physically. So I feel that a big portion of that can be using ketones and the ketogenic lifestyle to help. Again, we're paleo, really, if you think about it. That's really how we are. But because we've been exposed to glucose for so long, our bodies become so efficient at burning glucose that sometimes you have to fight to force it back the other way. And that's why when we do things like a ketogenic lifestyle or fasting, we have to it's almost like a severe shift the other way. And a ketogenic diet, for those of you who don't know, is a high-fat, low-carb, moderate protein diet. Now, there's plenty of ways to do keto that are not healthy. I espouse a clean keto, all right? Clean source of your meats and your fats. Clean source, not using dairy, things that are inflammatory and allergenic to our systems that we're not really meant to be doing. But if you increase your fat and keep your protein moderate and your carbs low, you can kind of burn off that caloric store of glucose, and then your body has to be forced to shift into another fuel source, in this case, fat. And it'll break down the fat you're eating for fuel. It'll also break down your own body fat for fuel. It gives you a lot of different things. You can go on Google and just type in ketones and so many things will come up. But it burns fat while sparing muscle. Remember, we talked about when you go through those periods of famine, you need to spare that muscle, right? So ketones, not because you're burning fat, they don't need to come from muscle. So they're going to protect your muscle, and there's even research showing how it genetically actually can help you build muscle without even really having to do exercise. I'm not saying don't do exercise, all right? It suppresses appetite. It helps with better, longer sustainable energy. Remember, glucose is kind of like a spike and crash, right? How many of us eat food and 2 hours later we're either exhausted or we're hungry, or both? Or we have a sugar craving, right? Because glucose burns really fast and then comes crashing back down, and your body's like, oh, I need more glucose because I just burned through all that fuel that's really fast burning. Let me get some more. And we do this all day long. That's why a lot of times the way they kind of come after glucose when it comes to dietary shift is they have more complex carbs, more protein, and smaller meals. So that way you don't get these big spikes. You kind of do more of this. And that's helpful, right? Because you're not getting giant boluses of insulin all the time. But I propose more of an option where you have a ketone. Ketones bring you up into about here and they keep you steady. Then if you ever built a fire, kindling is something that burns really hot and fast. So like newspaper. All right. And if you burn that and you're only making a fire out of kindling, how long is that going to last before you have to throw more on the fire and throw more on the fire and throw more on the fire? No one's cooking a steak over a newspaper. At least I don't think so. All right. Now coal, a little different story. It may take a little bit to get going. Once you do, that's a long-lasting, solid, sustainable fuel source. And that's kind of how ketones work. And because of that, you're not hungry as much. You're not constantly looking for fuel. Biologically speaking, the main reason we get hungry is because we're looking for fuel. So if your body has a fuel source it doesn't need to be looking for all the time, you're not hungry all the time. And the cool thing about ketones is they've been shown in the research that they actually will increase your body's ability to be receptive to insulin. So it actually lowers insulin resistance. So not only are you going to take away the insulin bolus that's constantly bombarding your bodies and cells with something it's so used to, so we can get a break, it's also making the cells receive that insulin in a better way than they were before. It also lowers something called leptin resistance, which is your brain not telling you you're full. There's so many different things. It's a better fuel for your body and your brain. It can use great for athletes. It can be great for Alzheimer's. It can be great for even cancer. It's a great diet for. So these are things that I just mentioned a bunch of diseases that we're all considered genetic, right? But really what it comes down to is if we treat our bodies the way we're genetically supposed to be, we may not express those things, or we're less likely to. Or at the very least, put them off till way to the very end. So I hope that kind of makes some sense about eating differently for our genetics. Yeah, is there a skinny gene? I mean, not really. There is and there isn't. But it comes down to what have you expressed, what have you turned on or turned off in your lifetime or even your previous generation's lifetime, and how can you make that difference? We can all change those epigenetic expressions. We're not a slave to our genetics. It's really our choices that we make and things we're exposed to, mental, physical, and chemical, that can trigger our body to make shifts in one direction or the other. So I teach people how to take control of that so they can actually start to reverse those things that are bothering them. And not be a slave to someone saying, oh, well, you have the BRCA gene, you're definitely going to have breast cancer. Or you have the APOE4 gene, you're going to get Alzheimer's. No, those are just things telling you your body is predisposed to having them, and that gun is a little more loaded than someone else's, but you don't have to pull that trigger. So there are ways to go after that, and this is what we do in my office and what we do in the Vitality Center. So I appreciate you all letting me speak today, and I'll be available to take questions today and tomorrow. I'll be speaking a little bit more in depth on all this tomorrow as well, and I hope to see you guys all then.